There'll be cards coming down the aisle if any of you want to write questions for the panelists who presented the papers or for any of the discussants. Our three discussants today are people who have actually dealt with this problem in different dimensions. Our first is Bill Hobby, Chancellor of the University of Houston, Sid Richardson Professor at the University of Texas LBJ School, and the Radoslav Sanov Professor of Political Science at Rice. Three positions would be enough for anyone. But in addition to that, Bill is also, was also the Lieutenant Governor of Texas from 1972 to 1990, a position he held longer than anybody else who's held that position. During his tenure as Lieutenant Governor, Bill Hobby was a champion of public and higher education, and probably most uniquely, he presided over one of the most significant reforms of social welfare policy in the state of Texas, which included, in fact, a significant enhancement in spending on the part of the state for AFDC, food stamps, and other social welfare programs. So Bill is one of the few legislators, and probably one of the few Texas legislators, who's actually dealt with the problem of devolution before it occurred. John Norquist is the 37th mayor of the city of Milwaukee, first elected to this office in 1988 and recently elected to his third four-year term. He's a former state legislator from Milwaukee. He also received his master's degree from the La Follette Institute of Public Affairs at Wisconsin, where he was a student of Peter Eisinger's, hence the Wisconsin connection. Governing Magazine has characterized John Norquist as an administrator who has gone it alone. He's among those few mayors of big cities that has eschewed any federal assistance, not any, but a great deal of it. He's one of those few mayors who will actually publicly tell you you might be better off not getting federal assistance. He has embraced management techniques for city government that are unknown to many cities and has been successful at, as the Governing Magazine pointed out, getting more for less. He also is, I think, one of those mayors that Peter talked about who has been successful at dealing with this issue of devolution long before it was popular in the press. Our last discussant today is John Engler, the governor of Michigan since 1990. He, prior to his tenure, was the youngest elected state legislator to Michigan at the tender age of 20, when most of us were doing things probably that didn't involve government except on the other side, probably, of the law. Governor Engler has lived and practiced supply-side economics. He's led his state from 1990 out of what was a major recession, and done so not by increasing taxes, but as various experts will tell you in different counts, at least cut property taxes significantly, and 22 other times cut state taxes. During this period of time, he's seen his state go through an economic renaissance. Maybe most important is the fact that he has led a bipartisan effort on the part of governors throughout this state to push for welfare reform. And again, Governing Magazine, it's not the only magazine I read, but one that I would recommend, pointed out that he was one of the leading advocates lobbying both the President and Congress during the last year for welfare reform. I've asked Bill Hobby to start first, and then we'll go to John Engler and then to John Norquist.
Bob, thank you very much. During Professor Peterson's remarks, he referred a few years ago to the time of troubles that Texas went through, and pointed out that the federal government didn't come in and bail out Texas. Mayor Norquist said something kind of under his breath about S&Ls, but moving right along. But at the time that Professor Peterson refers to, Texas Ox was indeed in the ditch, and the person whose name comes to mind, most public officials' mind, probably under those circumstances, is Felix Royton with Lazard Frere. And so I called Felix, whom I did not know at that time, and said, "Hey, Texas is in the ditch, can you help?" And he allowed himself to be persuaded that in fact he could. And he sent a very able team down here, headed by a gentleman whose name I will reveal to you in just a minute. I was then Lieutenant Governor, which in Texas involves being chairman of the Legislative Budget Board, and now former Governor Ann Richards was state treasurer. And so the Lazard Frere team was here not to keep Texas from going bankrupt. We were in fact bankrupt, but to teach us some of the tricks about how to fool people. And those tricks basically were the introduction and sale of the first what are politely called revenue anticipation notes, and the second reform was making better use of cash flow. That means borrowing from the future. You know, postponing the payday for one day, and all those kind of those kind of little gimmicks. And actually, we were, as I said, we're bankrupt, but with the expert advice of this team from Lazard Frere, we got through that crisis, and it gives me great confidence to know that a gentleman that I came to know quite well at that time, named Frank Raines. Frank has just gone from being White House Budget Director to Director of the Office of Management and Budget. So I know Frank knows all the tricks because he taught us quite a few of them. Passing on more directly to how devolution and devolution really, for purposes of this discussion, means the welfare bill passed by Congress and signed by President Clinton a few months ago. What does that really mean to the states? And I will. There's only one state whose finances I know fairly well, and that's Texas. So I'll discuss in very specific terms that briefly. Texas operates on a 2-year budget cycle. The legislature meets in the spring of the odd-numbered years, passes a 2-year Appropriations Act, which is basically a 3-year economic forecast, and the Budget Board has estimated that this will result in a reduction in federal funds in the forthcoming biennium, because that's the way we think about things in Texas, of $800 million. That's out of next year. Next session will be it'll be a $50 billion biennial budget, 48, 50 long in there somewhere. So the 800 million out of that gives you a little sense of perspective. What is interesting and significant in this discussion here in Texas, which is a low taxing, low service providing state, low welfare benefits, low aid to education, low everything. Last biennium, for the first time, federal aid became the largest revenue source of the state government, past the sales tax, which is the basic revenue source. So even in a low service state like Texas, federal aid is not all of a sudden, but has recently become the largest single source of revenue that the state government has, and that is a very sobering thought. Now, as various of the participants, Professor Rashofsky and Professor Peterson pointed out, and Ken Bickers, because of the way this bill is structured, there's about a 5-year run-out period. So in Texas, at least, the big bite will come not at the next legislative session, which starts here in a few months, but in the session 2 years after that is where the crunch really will come. Interestingly, in the all the discussions that went on in Congress and in the discussions with President Clinton that Professor Peterson referred to, there certainly was the broad consensus that AFDC doesn't work. It's been an unsuccessful program. But there was no consideration that I read about or heard about in you know, the concept that we hear all the time that the states are the laboratories of social policy and fiscal policy. Okay, if the desired, if the results, which we all share, the nation shares overwhelmingly, to change our welfare system in order to reduce dependency on public funds, to bring about more employment, and so forth, wouldn't it be worth looking at the social welfare policies in the various states? And there is a wide variation, as various of these papers indicate. Does in fact are the low benefit states in fact more prosperous than the high benefit states? Is employment, or put it the other way around, is unemployment lower in the low benefit states than in the high benefit states? The answer to both those questions is basically no. So the only point is that what evidence is available on the effects of these social policies, I could not see that any consideration was given to that evidence in the debate. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Governor. John Engler?
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be part of this panel. I'm eager to have this opportunity. I know that Secretary Baker's vision was that this be a bridge, the Institute be a bridge between the world of ideas and the world of action. And well, we heard a lot of ideas earlier represented in the papers, but I feel like I did when I sat in front of Congress. And the one thing I would tell these congressional committees is that there was one difference between the governors that were here testifying and you people up there passing the laws. We actually have to run the programs. And that's one of the differences between the people who write the papers and those of us who are here actually have to run the programs. I want to point out, I guess just a couple of things by way of introduction. I'm a big advocate for devolution. I think we ought to get power out of Washington. Quicker the better, as much as we can, as fast as we can. Welfare is a perfect example of a failed program. Nobody can defend it. It's a disaster. It's entrapped people, it's ruined families, it's destroyed cities. It's a terrible failure, and it should have come home a long time ago. As for the money, we have this quaint notion in Michigan that those were actually our dollars that went down there, you see. And so if we could keep them in Michigan, since we send $1 and get 88 cents back, it's not a very good deal. And so we'd rather just try to be responsible for some of these own issues and problems ourselves. And when I look at welfare policy, the argument was this in Washington. We sat down, and this was never possible until we had the 104th Congress, because we never, at least in 40 years, had a majority in the House of Representatives who would countenance the idea of giving up power, of sending something back home. I mean, they have been on a power grab, power accumulating, decision-making mission for a lot of years, and at the expense, I would argue, of state and local governments, and I think at the expense frequently of sound policy that actually could help families. And I think the welfare system started out, if we go back to its origin, to help needy families, help widows, help orphans way back when. It was never the system designed to become the centerpiece of what I think is the poverty industry in America today. So I think changes were long, long overdue, and I think we have to keep in mind that we want to help families. That's what this is all about. How do we help families? And we don't help them. The best welfare system conceived of in the United States, or in frankly any country, is no substitute for having that family be employed, be in charge of their own lives, making the basic decisions that most families make for themselves. And so in Michigan, we took the approach that we ought to break with the past and see what we can do to start strengthening families. And that meant a lot about people being accountable and being responsible. When I became governor in 1991, one of the first things we set out to do was end a program. No, Texas doesn't have this program, and in fact, 35 other states didn't have it at the time, and now fewer have it, but we used to pay state benefits for single adults. These were childless adults, and primarily men, actually, but some women, and they just weren't working, so we'd send them a check. And we kind of thought that that was a silly thing to do, that if they weren't working, they ought to be working, they ought to find a job, and it sort of worked out if they'd work 30 hours a month at minimum wage, they'd be better off than getting that check. So we said we're going to end that program. That took about 83,000 adults and put them out into the workplace. This was very traumatic in Michigan because we didn't study it, we didn't phase it in, we didn't do a test county, we just eliminated the program and moved on. Said then our next challenge is how do we help families where there's a parent and there's kids, the AFDC population. And it was very clear that we had to go to Washington, and we did, and got down and on our knees and pleaded with them for some waivers. And this was a process that began under the Reagan presidency, and George Bush gave Michigan the first big waiver package. And then Bill Clinton, after he was elected, continued what had been a policy of granting waivers, and he accelerated it. But the governors had argued that one waiver at a time is not welfare reform. That just takes too long to get through the bureaucracy. And another Wisconsin product, Secretary Shalala, was not exactly an advocate for getting us through that process. So we said there has to be broader reform. And when we got the 104th Congress back and pick that point up, we finally had individuals who said, well, let's see what the states have got to say. And we sat down, and it was very clear that there was a need to get about the balancing of the federal budget to deal with that problem. And we felt there was a converging of interests, in effect, that there was the possibility for the grand strategy, which said, you know, you're going to be looking at dealing with your budgetary issues. We think there are many programs that are currently dominated by Washington. If you will turn those back to the states, that we're so confident of our ability to improve the programs, we think we can do it for less money. And so we thought that was the outline of the possible bargain that could be struck. As you've heard in the Washington debate, after two bills got vetoed and the third one became politically necessary, we did finally get a piece of welfare reform signed into law, but along the way we end up with more money than we could have imagined, more money we would have gotten under the old system, as has been pointed out. There were no cuts, folks. Need to understand that. We didn't cut any budgets. We're just having debate about the rate of increase, the rate of growth in programs. And I don't know Bill's numbers in Texas, that $800 million number sounds like somebody maybe had an anticipated rate of growth and maybe won't be anticipating quite as much, but I don't know. I mean, we get into those little debates, but the Washington debate in this area has all been about how much is the increase going to be, and one side saying the increase ought to be bigger than you think it ought to be. And we frankly said, look, we'll take the money, but the real thing that we can have is all the strings. What we've been getting is strings without money, and if we could get money without strings, we thought that was a better deal. And so that's where we wanted to go. And this bill doesn't get us all the way there, but I'll tell you, it gets us down the road. And I think it's nonsense to talk about a race to the bottom. We could have been racing for decades now under the old federal system. It was only in about 1988, I think, that they actually locked in some maintenance of effort language. Prior to that, we could have all cut welfare grants right to the minimum. We determined what the level of cash assistance. There's never been a policy in America so that Texas had to pay the same welfare grant, and I think it's about 100, and family of three, probably cash assistance has been 150 maybe down here, I'd guess, in that range. We're at 459 in Michigan. Vermont's 900. I mean, you'd think that everybody's poor to go to Vermont if you're, or that hasn't happened. And you got state by state differences, which are pretty dramatic, but there are lots of reasons why there is some mobility, I'd concede that, and sometimes we've had the problem on our border with Indiana folks from Indiana coming, the Gary, Indiana area coming into what would be southwest Michigan. But it isn't, we would never argue that's something that really drives all of the policy. What we do think drives it is a system that's just been filled with disincentives to work. And until this bill got signed, you literally couldn't have two parents in the family. Now, we did that because we got a waiver. It was mentioned earlier, you couldn't earn $1 because you got punished. And that's something that doesn't show up in any of the studies that were done here today that we've heard reported on, is the impact of people on public assistance earning their own money from a real job. But we've got about a third of our caseload today that remain on AFDC in Michigan working, earning income. That average income is about $400 a month, what they're earning. And our one of the waivers that we got in Michigan, we think there ought to be an incentive to work, and we think you do end welfare when people go to work. And so what we've done, so the first $200 you earn, you keep, period. And you keep 20% above that. Now, other states have done other modifications of that and do it in different ways, but we wanted people who are on public assistance to understand if they went to work and they got a check, they got to keep it. We thought that was reinforcing the right direction, and that has been very helpful. We've closed over 100,000 cases where families are earning too much money because they're working. They're not getting cash assistance anymore. That's a positive trend. We're under 500,000 total people on public assistance in our state for the first time in 25 years. That 100,000 case closure is the largest of the top 10 states in terms of population. So we've made great progress. The percentage of people on public assistance who actually work in the private sector is about been around 9% nationally, 8-9%. As I said, we're about at a third, 31%. So that's a positive thing. What the new federal welfare law finally does is give the states the power to say to someone who's on public assistance that there is a job there, and if you don't take it, you're not going to get a check. That has not been possible in the past. The process to get that done has been very, very difficult, very litigious, and we think we can shortcut that now. One thing that we are not going to do in Michigan, and I know Professor Rashofsky talked about that in his paper, about all the training that the welfare workers got to have to help these poor people move into a job situation. That'd be the last place I'd look to have an employment agency, try to convert welfare workers. You know, we've got employment agencies. We got the Job Training Partnership Act agencies that are out there. A lot of this can be privatized. We work actively with groups like Manpower, Kelly Services. You contract that stuff out, but you don't try to take the welfare agency and make it into an employment agency. You want to change the nature. In fact, we felt so strongly we don't have a Department of Social Services anymore. We now call it the Family Independence Agency, try to communicate what we're trying to do. And we don't have a welfare grant anymore. We have a family independence grant, because the idea is that we're getting that family back to work. And I think we got to be absolutely firm on that across the board. And I think the other thing that people have been doing this through waivers. Now the thing that we have is the ability to do it as we decide it's necessary and implement it without going to Washington. If you want to make waiver benefit payment contingent on are the kids in school, you can do that now. One thing that's changed under this policy, we used to say that the way you could get benefits if you're a minor child, get pregnant, have a baby, and then you're suddenly a family, and if you're 16 years old with a child, you get your own apartment, you're now a family. Well, we had gotten a waiver that said, no, you can't do that. Under the new federal law, you can't do that. You have to stay at home. So there are some changes here that are going to be very, very helpful. I would agree that the law, it didn't go far enough. I would argue, I guess to get the other point of view here so we can have a lively discussion later on, that leaving food stamps out was a big mistake. That's a fraud-ridden program in America. We think electronic benefits are going to help, and we got a Regulation E change that was part of this federal legislation, which will accelerate dramatically our ability to set up the networks. But we got to get the food stamps in. Food stamps today, $1 script of food stamps is about 66 cents or 65 cents on the street in Detroit. It's cash. It just isn't it's not a very efficient way to provide cash benefits. We ought to draw that in. There really ought to be, hypothetically, no reason for anybody in America to be hungry with the food stamp programs that we have in this nation. But if you cash the food stamps and buy alcohol or drugs with them, then there's probably someone going to be hungry. We ought to be able to fix that. And that's just a process thing in my mind. The Medicaid system, the same way. We're already, I think, showing what we've been able to do with the managed care strategies in Medicaid, but it strikes most governors as, and this is across the partisan lines, and everything I'm saying really, I think, You know, you would have, I can find Democratic governors who are very much supportive of this. They might be more polite in their characterization of events, but I mean, they would agree, I think, with the thrust that you cannot, with the current system, leave the Medicaid alone. You've got to have a way where we can have a system. You shouldn't have unlimited choice if you're not working, have no income, you've got a Medicaid card, and you get to choose your provider. If you're working for the auto company or almost anywhere else, you've got a managed care plan, and they'll tell you who your doctor is unless you want to pay more to go there. I mean, and that's just, I mean, we've got more choice and more flexibility for medical care with some of the people, and then you've got other people who are completely, the question of uninsureds in this nation. We happen to have a fairly small number, and we've actually taken Medicaid savings and put in place a Healthy Kids initiative. So we've taken kids, about 75,000 of them that were in families up to, all kids up to 150% of poverty, under the theory that that was the family most likely to be knocking on the door looking for benefits. If there was a health emergency in the family, they could be most quickly qualifying for public assistance. We said, let's give them insurance. Let's take care of that. And that's made a big difference. But Mike Levitt, for example, has got a plan in Utah, which I'd like to see him try, where he virtually could eliminate uninsureds in his state, but he'd do so by kind of an Oregon-type plan where he'd blend the benefit. You wouldn't have a Cadillac benefit for people not working and no benefit for people who are working at minimum wage. Instead, he'd try to have what he describes as the Chevy plan for everybody. Well, that makes more sense, I think, than the current system. He ought to be allowed to try that. He can do it under a waiver today, except he can't get the waiver. Now with the election over, maybe that'll change, but those are the kinds of things that the states are chomping at the bit to go forward with. There's a lot more I could throw on the table here, but that's enough to get us, I think, get the discussion started at least, and then we'll get back to it. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm John Norquist, Mayor of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I wanted to talk about this subject not only on welfare, although I will say this about welfare, that cash grants instead of work is a bad idea, whether it's at the federal level or at the state level. But I do want to respond to some of the things that were said earlier about states, some of the cautions that you heard, and add a few to them. I think that John Engler has done great work. I respect it very much on welfare reform. And I believe that if any state is on the right track on this sort of thing, Michigan is certainly one of them. However, I do think that there's a sort of a cyclical love affair that happens with different levels of government. There was a feeling in the 50s and 60s that the federal government could solve almost any problem. The euphoria after World War II, the idea that the federal government could intervene. And so the federal government overreached and got into a lot of things that it wasn't successful at, and we're now in the age of states. Part of this was brought on by my president. I'm a Democrat. Bill Clinton, as governor, took the state organization, the National Governors Association, and turned every one of their meetings that he went to into sort of a Renaissance weekend. And you had this sort of policy wonk attitude by all the governors. They suddenly started to believe that they could accomplish almost anything. And the Republican governors that now are dominant, I have a lot of confidence in what they're doing, and they've especially John Engler has done a lot of things that he should be very proud of. But I do have a caution about it, because I do think that state governments have some difficulties in dealing with some of these issues. There are interstate issues that Paul talked about and Andy talked about that will come into play later on. And I just want you to know that as we move into the next century, we'll be entering a new age. That's the age of cities. That might surprise you, but the fact is that cities have been around a long time. And as Ambassador Secretary Baker knows well. There's a city in the Middle East called Damascus. It's been around for more than 4,000 years. It's had hundreds of national rulers, empires, the Greeks, the Romans, the Turks, and somehow it's managed to survive, which is my point, that nations, empires, provinces, states come and go, but cities endure, with a few exceptions like Carthage, which was destroyed by the Roman army. But cities, the reason they endure is because the cities are organic. They're a product of the economy, of natural occurrences, whereas the other forms of government are artificially placed. And so a lot of the attitudes towards cities that have developed over the last 40 years, in particular after World War II, have been a product of a discussion that's been very harmful to cities, and that discussion is now changing. One of the ways to think about cities, this is sort of I'm a minister's son, but my memory isn't perfect. In the first few verses of Lamentations, woe is the city that was full of people. She that was a princess among the provinces has become a vassal. All her friends have betrayed her. She weeps bitterly in the night. The federal relationship, to kind of skip over the states for a minute, the federal relationship with cities in America has been largely toxic. If you look at the position that cities had at the end of World War II, cities had, for the most part, private transit systems that were good. Economic development was focused in cities. Cities had social service systems that were functional for the most part. Cities had governments that could answer the immediate problems of people, sometimes through machines that might not have looked pretty to Harvard professors, but they got the job done. Suddenly the cities bit into the federal apple. It started in the Depression in 1932-33. My city, represented by Mayor Dan Hoan, was one of the founders of the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Mayor Curley in Boston and Mayor Walker in New York and so forth, and they asked for some temporary federal help during the Depression. And as time went on, the temporary help became more permanent, especially after World War II. And then all of a sudden, cities were looking to the federal government for almost every single issue you could imagine. Housing, transportation, all kinds of things that before cities had been involved in on their own. And the results weren't that good. For example, in transportation, the federal government, because it's dominant, half the board of directors of the federal government is made up of states, 2 votes per state, so that North Dakota and South Dakota outvote New York State 4-2 anytime they want to. You have a very rural-oriented board of directors. And if you look at all federal funds, for example, there's one study that was done, if you count the cost of maintaining federal land and grazing rights and all kinds of other things and federal bases, and you put it all together, Wyoming, under the study, which granted was put out by somebody that was trying to make a point, but they get about $4 back for every dollar they put in. And New York City pays in $3 for every dollar they get back, and Wyoming thinks they're subsidizing New York City. And so I made the point to my fellow mayors. We had a conference in 1991 in which we had no organization involved, the U.S. Conference of Mayors or the League. The mayors actually talked to themselves. David Dinkins convened it. And I made the point that the federal government was not a very good deal for cities, and that we should switch sides, and that we should stop trying to build our cities on federal money, because first of all, it was disappearing, and the cost of asking for it was so great. The humiliation felt bad, but it also cost us money. And I'll give you an example. In 1992, while George Bush was president, Secretary Baker will remember this, we had a riot in Los Angeles in response to a verdict that was very unpopular concerning Rodney King. And billions of dollars was burned up within 48 hours. And there was a reaction. Secretary Kemp went there. Candidate Bill Clinton went there. Eventually, President Bush went there. They all expressed their concern. And of course, the U.S. Conference of Mayors had an advisory board meeting, which I was a member of. And we met in Washington to decide on how we were going to have an urban agenda. And I was very uncomfortable with that because we went around the room trying to think of what items we were going to put on the agenda, it occurred to me that whatever concern the government figures had, the elected officials had, that would tend to fade as soon as the CNN cameras disappeared. But there was one group of people, and I said this to my fellow mayors, there was one group of people that would remember South Central LA and what happened there for a long, long time. And that group of people are investors, whether they're insurance companies, banks, whether they're in Germany or Japan or the United States or England or wherever. And investors normally do not want to put their money where it'll be burned. And for us as mayors of cities to associate ourselves with this calamity and somehow feel that by drawing attention to it, that would help us. It might help us get a few federal dollars. You know, maybe today, if we had been successful, we'd have 3.5% of our budgets instead of 3%. But we were in a position where we would be chasing away private investment. And here we do live in a capitalist country. We live in a free market economy. And so for cities to try to build their economies based on fear, you know, you give us money or we'll riot, we'll burn ourselves if you don't give us money. It's sort of with Halloween just over, it's like trick or treat, you might remember. Or to try to build cities on pity is a mistake, because fear turns into hatred and pity turns into contempt. And so it's not a good way to build your city. And the benefits of getting these federal programs is often dubious. I'm not saying they're all bad. In fact, we apply for many of them, even some that might be a little bit dubious. You always have to make a judgment about it. But for example, the police program. The police program pays part of the cost, then it pays a little less, and then it pays a little less, and then the fourth year it's gone. And over a 10-year period, we calculated in Milwaukee that 9% of the costs of the police would be paid by this federal grant. Now we can handle it because we have managed our finances well. We have a AA+ bond rating. Over the last 9 years that I've been mayor, we've cut the tax rate every year. We spend less than the rate of inflation. We manage our finances so we're able to handle the increase in police. We've already, before the federal government gave us any money, we had already added over 200 new police officers because we felt that added value to our economy. But there are communities that can handle that. Places like East St. Louis or Newark or some of the cities that have a really difficult time. Oakland, people say, where's the low-income neighborhood in San Francisco? It's Oakland. But, you know, how do they come up with the money? How do they do it? And the fact is that once they've paid for these cops with federal money and then the money disappears, then they're left in a terrible situation. So when I look at devolution, and I look at what's happening at the federal level, it doesn't seem like that big a threat. As the panelists have pointed out, it's only 3% of the funding anyway. And the federal government does tax too much money in the cities. It takes money out of Milwaukee, it takes money out of New York, and it spends on a lot of things that don't help cities and that doesn't add value to our economies. And so when I look at the federal government, I actually look forward to devolution. I think it's a real opportunity. And I just want to, in the short time I have, I just want to take a little bit of time to go through some federal programs so you get an understanding of the impact of what's happened in the last 50 years. I want to start out with housing. In housing, the federal government participated by having a tax deduction for home mortgages, which is a very popular thing to do, although the impact of it is largely felt by a small group of taxpayers. The majority of tax filers don't even file itemized deductions. But it seems like a wholesome thing to do anyway. Why not help somebody buy a home? And just if you look at it narrowly, it is a good thing. But the overall net effect has been to push more and more investment into single-family homes that are larger and larger over time. And there's a powerful incentive for people to buy a bigger and bigger house, and it ends up being for fewer and fewer people. And the kind of housing that people that are down and out, that traditionally have been able to restore their lives in cities, has been pushed off the investment charts. Not just because of the mortgage interest deduction, but also because of federal replacement of the private market in housing. And so if you look at the end of World War II, Pete Hamill wrote a book not long ago about his experiences growing up in New York City and all of the little cottage flats and back and all the various kind of housing schemes that you can find in Brooklyn. And you can find them in Milwaukee, and you can find them even in Houston. There's garages that have apartments above them and so forth. And this was the housing market where people that were at the bottom end of the economic structure at least had a chance, a place where you could get a $150 a month apartment. But by forcing investment into single-family housing, not just through the deduction, which is kind of a passive thing, but through FHA and through all kinds of other interventions, we've created a housing market that makes it very difficult for people that don't have a lot of money to find access to housing. In fact, the federal government even spent billions of dollars tearing down these buildings all over the place. The Urban Renewal Program, which wrecked large tracts of cities. Fortunately, in Milwaukee, we were slow to apply for the grants, but in St. Louis, the population of St. Louis in 1960 was about 900,000. Today, in 1950. Today, the population of St. Louis is about 370,000. So the population went down by over half. A similar event happened in Cleveland. Detroit used to have almost 2 million people. Now it has about 1 million. And they're hoping the next census that there'll be over 1 million. A lot of this was a product of federal programs. Sheldon Lubar, who's an investment banker in Milwaukee, a Republican, was an assistant HUD director under Nixon and Ford. And to this day feels bad about what happened while he was in federal government, where the FHA program created a situation where vast areas of Detroit were put in a position where housing was abandoned. People were given loans and couldn't pay it back, and then brokers came along and bought them back and then put them out again, and eventually the houses were ownerless. And these kinds of programs have not helped. They haven't been driven so much by cities asking for them, but by interest groups that hang around Washington. There's a whole industry built around mortgage banking and FHA, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, all of these different organizations. And it's had the net effect of undermining the natural housing market that served people fairly well in cities back in the 1920s. In transportation, Lewis Mumford in 1956, when the Interstate Highway Act was passed, said it would do more damage to American cities in the next 20 years than all the bombing in Europe did to European cities in World War II. If anything, that was an understatement, and Detroit would be about the best example of it. My parents had their honeymoon in Detroit in 1946. My father spent 3.5 years in a prison camp. He was on the Bataan Death March, and anybody that was on the Bataan Death March got a free honeymoon. And in those days, you could give a gift like that for a honeymoon. It seemed like the right thing to do. Today, that'd probably be politically incorrect. But my mother and my father lived in St. Paul, Minnesota, and they had a choice of 2 cities. This was a very restricted gift. They could only go to Minneapolis or Detroit. And so, but you laugh, but they have home movies. And they took pictures, and someday I'll show them to Governor Engler. And the way Detroit looked in 1946, it was a gorgeous city. You could bring to mind Vienna. They stayed at the Book Cadillac Hotel. And the street that the Book Cadillac Hotel on had a lot of other hotels. And it had the Hudson's department store. And 2 million people. A very successful city. And what happened was they did what even the Germans said not to do when they built the Autobahn. And what Norman Bell Geddes, who designed the interstate system and advised Franklin Roosevelt on it before it was implemented, said, don't build these divided superhighways in the middle of cities. It should only be between cities or around cities on a remote beltway, which is what you find in Europe. There's no European cities that have freeways close in, with the exception of Frankfurt, which the American Army ran at the end of the war. But the net effect of this was to just disperse the economy over the landscape. It made cities like Detroit suddenly very unimportant. And then in education, it's not so much a function of the federal government, although they played a role. State governments did more to undermine education by reinforcing a monopoly that took the natural advantage of cities. For some commodities, agricultural commodities or mining, you can find the best selection outside of cities. But for most goods and services, restaurants, manufactured products, machine tools, aerospace technology in the Houston area, whatever, when you have a lot of people living close together from a lot of diverse backgrounds and a lot of different skills, it creates high quality. You can see it in higher education in the United States. If you go to cities like New York or Chicago, you find the best universities, some of the best universities in the world, NYU, Columbia, Fordham in New York. Chicago, you have Northwestern and DePaul and Loyola, University of Illinois in Chicago, and of course, Chicago University, where people from all over the world compete to go to Chicago for higher education. But no one's going from all over the world to go to K through 12 education in Chicago public schools. People are repelled by urban America when it comes to education, because the natural advantage of cities has been thwarted by this massive intervention in the marketplace that has enfranchised a government monopoly. And so you look at these various interventions that have happened, and they've undermined the very natural advantages that cities have. And you look at cities around the world, and I'll end on this point. If you look at cities in other countries in the world, Paris in France, Berlin to Germany, Tokyo to Japan, or even for that matter, just across the border, Toronto in Canada, or Vancouver. And you'll find that people don't really fear cities, and they certainly don't pity them. If they have any emotion that's negative, it's they're jealous. But those countries, both their public and their private sectors, understand that cities have a value, that they're organic, that they produce wealth. They produce the wealth that allows leisure time and eventually allows culture and religion and civilization to be developed. That's what cities are all about. And that has been something that has, that fact and that tradition and that fact that has been true throughout world history has been temporarily, for the last 50 years, forgotten in the United States. And it's about to be rediscovered. That's what's happening with cities right now. And if you look at just the way cities look, compare cities, even Detroit, with all the problems that Detroit has. If you compare the beauty of those cities, even the ones that have empty buildings, compare it with the suburban strip smear, with the cartoon signs, the pylon signs, and the buildings that have no significance. Many of these environments have not even one building you could put on a picture postcard. Just the way they look. And you think about what's been built over the last 50 years and compare it with these gorgeous cities, some of which are still quite successful. Chicago, Cincinnati, Milwaukee, Pittsburgh, Boston. And Detroit will be successful. But if you compare the urban form and compare it with what's been created that was supposed to be superior to it, and which is actually hideously ugly, this smear that's been developed, you can see that just by the physical nature of it, that cities have a tremendous value. Now, there's been one person that understood this at the end of the war and did something about it. Main Street, which has not been built since World War II, over the last 50 years, has not been built, except in two places, Disneyland and Disney World. When you walk into the front gate, and Walt Disney knew this, he knew that when customers came to Disney World, that when they opened up the front gate, they did not want to see a strip mall. They wanted to see Main Street, because Main Street is beautiful. The urban form is beautiful. And the natural economies of cities is beautiful and productive and adds a lot of value. And so cities need to stop begging. We need to stop having any kind of tin cup strategy at all. If anybody wants to feel sorry for cities, don't talk to me. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear about it. Don't do things to be nice. Do things to add value. And city governments, I really believe, in the major cities, I'm talking about the 30 largest cities in the country, will have a tremendous 21st century when people realize that they add value to the civilization, they add value to the economy. Thank you.
Yeah. We have a few minutes for questions if the paper presenters would come back up, because I have questions here for them as well. And we will. I'll start actually with Governor Engler. The first question, Governor, was what is your state doing to force unwed fathers to face up to their financial responsibilities to support their children and to collect on child support?
We're doing everything we can. We've begun to do what have been identifying fatherhood right at the hospital, which is proving to be very successful. Working with we find that a surprising number of fathers who are unwilling to accept parental responsibility still do want to come and take a look at the baby, and so that's an amazing. The hospital participation, that's been very successful. We're also requiring as a condition of eligibility that the father be identified for receipt of benefits. So we're doing that, and we've historically been one of the top states. And tell you how tough this is in collecting child support. We've ranked first, second, or third, depending on which study at which time. And in Michigan, we probably have, and this goes back, but probably $2.5–3 billion of child support uncollected, and we're one of the tops at collecting it. And so we're going to get some help out of the changes in Washington, actually, on chasing some of these people down who are running nationally. So I think that's the other thing I want to do is that I am committed to a bill, which I haven't got the legislature to pass yet, but it's no pay, no play, basically for the males, because in too many situations, unfortunately, it is a bit of a badge of honor to be the father of a child or a couple of children, and we really think that unless somebody stepped up to the parental responsibility, and a young person may not have any resources, but they got time, and they can give us some of that time back, and they're asking society to pay their responsibilities. So the extracurriculars, from sports to everything else, ought to be impacted a little bit by this responsibility.
For Andy Rashofsky, you've painted a bleak picture for state tax revenues and job growth. Do you think major tax reform would spur economic growth and solve some of the problems of the welfare reform bill?
I think that overall major tax reform, if by that one means the move away from an income tax to a broad-based consumption tax or a flat tax, is, I guess, a very risky experiment. It's a big change. It involves changing a proven system, and certainly there are lots of problems with our existing income tax system. Tax simplification ought to be on the top of federal agenda, but nevertheless, the evidence suggests that while the move from an income tax to a consumption-based tax is likely to spur economic growth a little bit, it is not likely to do it to any great extreme, and it'll have a relatively high cost. It will lower taxes substantially for the very rich and raise them for everyone else.
If they do that, they better get rid of the payroll tax with it, otherwise it would be incredibly unfair to working people.
I also just want to make it very clear, I don't see these budget problems the way they're being described at all in terms of Andy's fears here, because I think hypothetically we've all got structural deficits. We assume we'll just keep spending regardless of what our revenues are. And I just think that the picture is way too gloomy. I do think that the one problem that states have, and we're trying to address it now, is some of the unfunded obligations, say on health insurance for state employees. And I think the public employee unions, both state employees and public school employees, probably are the greatest threat to a budget solvency down the road. Some of the contracts negotiated previously, some of the benefits already obligated, and that would even include university costs. I mean, all of these costs that are out there in the system are big ticket items, but I really think that there is a premium on states growing, and we've seen our unemployment rate come down. 21 tax cuts have made a difference, and what we saw is 192 months where we'd always been above the unemployment rate of the nation. Now we're working on 3 consecutive years where we've been below, and a lot of that has just been a very much a change in emphasis in terms of how we're going at it. Certainly we're helped with the automotive industry being strong, but it is much broader than that, and it's important to stress in industries like autos. The big three just got done with a round of contract talks. I mean, they're all talking about how many fewer workers they'll have at the end of this contract period. They're not trying to have more workers. So it's I just think we've just got an awful lot of opportunity in front of us, and I don't see the doom and gloom that is represented in your paper.
Let me throw this out to any of you, or all of the discussants. To what extent are waste, fraud, mismanagement, the failures of the federal system, likely to be exacerbated by devolution of welfare responsibility to the states?
Well, as a critic of states, I'll tell you that my biggest fear, I don't think it's the case with John Engler, but my biggest fear about states taking over everything, that the one thing they'll do with the money, with the block grant money, is protect their welfare bureaucracies. They'll give them the job training program or something like that. And these bureaucracies have a tendency not to really put the customer in the forefront because they're monopolies. And it's that is a real threat to poor people and also to taxpayers, that this money will be gobbled up with state bureaucracies, which collectively are much, much bigger than the federal social service bureaucracy.
I share the mayor's concern. I would say that somewhere in America there may be a state that would do it as poorly as the federal government does it everywhere. But I do have to worry, but I think competition sorts this stuff out very quickly, because one thing that's happening is you've got 50 states out there. The one thing that we do is, just like cities look, we look who's got a better idea. And I keep an eye on Tommy Thompson. What's Tommy doing? He's watching me. We're both watching George W. Bush, and we're what's happening out there. If somebody's got a good idea, you're quick to try to adapt that. And the other thing is that the accountability in a governor's race is brutal, and it's quick. I mean, if you're falling behind a neighboring state, you're not running a program as well. And so many states are competitive. It isn't, we don't have a situation where 40 years you don't change parties like they did in the House of Representatives in Washington. So you've got to stay on your toes, and I think that's the best thing we've got going, is this environment here. And I think the final factor is the federal law opens up remarkable collaborative possibilities with the private sector. I mean, we've already, for some time now, we did this back in '91 when we got rid of that general assistance program I mentioned earlier. We contracted with the Salvation Army to be in charge of homeless programs. We figured they had about a century more experience than we did running these programs. And so 2.5 million nights of lodging, I think average cost $8.95 for the housing, and administrative costs, it was a couple of percent. I mean, it was minuscule. And we could never have done it inside government. And now you're having literally the prospect of contracting out. In fact, my former welfare director, very talented man, who's one of the key state negotiators with Congress, is now in Austin, Texas, working for the Lockheed Company as part of a major effort to prepare to bid now around the country to run programs. And so you're seeing remarkable potential being opened up here, and that could lead to the collapse of welfare bureaucracies. And that's one of the reasons you had such a fight from the poverty industry. Despite nobody could defend the old program, it sure died hard because there were a lot of people who had a vested interest in keeping it going the way that it was. And some of those were the employees, and who represents the employees but AFSCME, and John Sweeney gets involved here, and why does he spend $100 million? See, it all fits together.
Sure.
Can I add just a tiny little footnote about fraud? I don't know if the states can do it better than the federal government, but the federal government doesn't do too badly, actually. If you look at food stamp fraud, or fraud in all of the food assistance programs, really pretty low. Governor Engler mentioned food stamp trafficking, which, sure, it's a problem. It's a problem in the cities. But the best studies indicate that it's not very expensive compared to the total expense of the program. The same with other kinds of food stamp fraud, phony applicants and so on. You're always going to get some bad apples, but as a percentage of the cost of the program, it's pretty small. And I think the best studies indicate the federal government administers that element of food stamps pretty well.
This is a question for, again, any of the panelists. To which concern will Congress be more responsive? Growing federal deficits or growing state deficits as a result of the shift, to follow Andy and to some extent Peter's arguments, as a result of the devolution?
Well, I mean, I don't think they're going to be growing state deficits. So but I wouldn't expect a lot of Congress to be very responsive to that if that were the case. I do think if you have the Great Recession that happens down the road, I think you can look at that a little bit like you look at the hurricane that hits. I mean, there are going to be examples where you could a hypothetical could be created where it's just so overwhelming. I think at that point you might expect the states would go to Congress and say there's a need for help on this, but I think for the run-of-the-mill emergency, no, I don't think you're going to find the help. So I think Congress ought to be paying attention to their own financial balance sheet, but I don't think they should turn a deaf ear, and I don't think they will. They haven't. When natural disasters occur, I doubt that they would if economic disasters would occur.
Yeah, I think there's an underlying assumption that somehow there's a zero-sum game, that government programs just go on, and a lot of the management techniques that the private sector has applied are now being applied to the public sector. Peter Drucker and people like him have shared their wisdom with government leaders, and a few of them are actually listening. And there are concepts that are coming into place, like spending less than the rate of inflation, which gives you at least a little move toward productivity. That means you're spending less. I just want to give you an example of how a government program can work. Wonderful people in our health department in the city of Milwaukee, but when Medicaid came along, it was a threat. They had always provided immunizations to low-income children that had been sort of guaranteed work. And so when Medicaid came along, insurance companies were supposed to supply it. So then our health department went out and made arrangements, even contracts with the insurance companies, prohibiting them from giving immunizations to the Medicaid children so that they would have to come to the city. Now, if you look at that, you have city taxpayers already paying state and federal taxes for Medicaid for the immunizations. They get to pay again local property taxes, and the customer, the low-income family that's eligible for Medicaid, have to take their children to two places, to the regular clinic, then told to go somewhere else. They have to go to the city clinic. And so we ended up having immunizations drop below 26% when the field is supposed to be 90% of the kids in the community inoculated. So we had a measles epidemic. 2 kids died. I'm not saying that they died because of that. And then the health department, they look back at it and say, yeah, that was really dumb. We should turn that around. And instead, the insurance companies should provide it, and we shouldn't provide it. We shouldn't make people go to two places. So we're wasting money. And that's an extreme example, but not that extreme. And the federal government has just started, in defense of Democrats, who occasionally have gotten a few snide comments today. Let me tell you something. Under Reagan and Bush, the federal bureaucracy increased about 300,000. Under Al Gore and under Bill Clinton and Al Gore, it's been reduced about 240,000 with some help from some Republicans, granted. But they've applied some management techniques that the federal government had never tried before, and they're going to get better and better. It's going to accelerate, and it's going to come from both parties. And I think the federal government will get a lot better at things. And I'm not convinced, even with innovative people like Governor Engler, that the federal government, and this is getting back to the basic point on welfare, that the state governments really are going to handle this issue better than the federal government could. And let me give you the scenario that could have happened. If the Clinton administration had tried to have some kind of portable national health insurance, moderate version that wouldn't offend everybody, if they had tried to sell that as part of welfare reform, and they had done used welfare techniques like John Engler's tried, and tried to make the national program do that so that it crossed interstate lines and you didn't have a race to the bottom and all that sort of thing. If they tried to do welfare right at the federal level, that might have worked better. In fact, Phil Gramm, the senator from Texas, a good Republican by anybody's definition, he attacked Bob Dole during the primaries, saying that just punting the welfare issue to the states wasn't enough, that the federal government ought to clean up its own welfare mess. Unfortunately, the issue didn't go anywhere in the campaign. But he was probably right. And I really am not convinced that the states, Michigan I think will handle it well, but I'm not convinced that when we look at this again 5, 10, 15 years from now, that it might not make sense for the national government. Maybe President Engler will deal with the welfare issue on a national basis.
What I would argue, just as a governor, is this.
You have to jump in.
The way to get the best result would be to really, if you ask Washington today what state runs the best welfare program, they can't tell you. They don't know. That's not something we figure out. What we're into is measuring basically inputs. I'd turn the whole thing around and say, all right, let's have an annual report prepared at each state and break it down to subdivisions, the county and city. Tell me, how many families do we able to move off public assistance this year? How many kids are immunized? How many teens got pregnant? Did we identify the father? How much child support's paid? What was our dropout rate? Did people go to school? And I'd list, 10, 12 of those sort of key, what Bill Bennett would talk about as cultural indicators, and list those out and say, all right, let's sort of measure everybody. And then you tell me how the state that's consistently last has its governor and its legislature get reelected when the people trying to get the office are saying, look where we rank. And have Congress hold hearings on the 5 states that do the best job and the 5 states that do the poorest job, sort of do that education. Because I do think that we could do things a lot differently than we do them. And in terms of federalizing it, this is the issue Congress never wanted to deal with. They were never willing to say that a poor person in Texas ought to be getting the same in their family as the poor person in Michigan. And they were perfectly willing to lock Michigan in permanently at $400 a month higher than Mississippi, let's say. Well, that's not fair, because then there's a cost to that. Now, we are not, as has been suggested in some of the academic studies, that somehow there's going to be a race to get everybody down to 100. We're not headed there. We could have been there on medical care. Something in the Medicaid, about 80% of the cost of Medicaid is, well, I would say 80, that maybe a little, 68, I think is the percentage, is optional spending. We don't have to spend it, but we do. And we'll continue to do that. So until they federalize something and make it the same everywhere, it won't work. And if they try to lock everybody in, Vermont at $900 and Mississippi at $120, that won't work either. So I would argue we don't have a federal system. We just got a federal government trying to make too darn many policies and too many rules and regulations. in welfare as well as other areas. And I would certainly just, I don't know if I'll get a chance to talk again, just let me say it, in the education area, which was mentioned earlier, and sitting through this morning's session on crime, there's no question that these are all related. As we talk about the agenda, as we look at domestic policy challenges at the end of the century, I mean, these are all interrelated. I mean, this was, in effect, the winning campaign that didn't get run, I guess, but in terms of tying these together, because breaking the education monopoly is very, very important. We've got to provide choices for parents, and we've got to have schools. In many of these inner cities, the schools, we're paying enough today to have a school that's year-round and have these kids in a classroom literally all year long and trying to help them catch up, to get ahead. It's safer, and we could provide lots of different options given the flexibility. In Michigan, we're knocking down the doors, but it is literally hand-to-hand, house-to-house kind of combat to get that done. We do have 80 charter schools open, and we've got, of our 500 traditional districts now, all but 150 or so have opened up to full interdistrict choice. So we've got mobility, and we've got stunned school superintendents who lost, one case, the superintendent lost 300 kids out of his district, and the money follows the kid. So when the kid leaves, the check goes right along with them. And the superintendent said, we're not going to let that happen. We're going to make some changes. Hey, he's getting it, you know. I mean, that's right. That's what we'd like to see, and that's the kind of stuff that ought to take place out there.
Last question. It starts with Ken Vickers, but it's open. Often nonprofits compete with private for-profit businesses, especially small businesses. Nonprofits are often inefficient, bureaucratic, and corrupt. Why can't your theory of the states and their handling of the devolution make more and better use of private entrepreneurs? Why would they be in competition?
Well, they're going to be in competition. Actually, the states are likely to use both for-profits and non-profits. They're probably going to use for-profits quite a lot. One of the arguments for using non-profits is when trust is involved, when there's a service that is hard to measure, hard to tell if the service is being adequately delivered. Something like counseling to teenage mothers for how to kind of get their lives in order, that sort of thing. Often the argument is that nonprofits, because they can't, they're not doing it for profit, that they are likely to be more trustworthy. But I think what we're going to see is what John Norquist and Governor Engler are talking about. I think we're going to see tremendous competition at the local level between for-profits and nonprofits. I think the reason nonprofits are in some ways more interesting is not because they're going to be competing or not. It's that when eligibility runs out for some of these people who particularly in a period of recession, if there are not jobs there and if they haven't successfully made the transition, and granted, many people will, in fact, successfully make the transition. Incentives matter. People will respond to the incentives. But there are going to be people who don't make that transition into work. For those people, when their eligibility runs out, they're going to go to the doors of the nonprofits and ask for help. The nonprofits we're talking about here include things like Salvation Army and the other traditional nonprofits, but it's also your local churches. That's where people go when they're in trouble, when they're desperate. And it's the church organizations, the conferences of the ministerial alliances and that sort of thing that I think are going to start pushing for some kind of emergency assistance. And that's where you start seeing this kind of mobilization. The other thing I'd say about that is it's precisely what Mayor Norquist said. When organizations take money from federal government, but you can be more general than that. When they take money from government and they hire people and they rent space and they buy computers and all of that kind of stuff, they start needing continuing sources of revenue. They've got to, they now have a commitment to stay in business, and it's that drives them to want certainty. It's that drives them to want to make sure that they can fund their operation the next year. And that's why I think it's not just for-profits and nonprofits. Obviously, they're both involved. But the nonprofits, when they get hit with this need for emergency help, that's where I think we're going to see the mobilization to go back to government. Because I think when the economies are growing, like Michigan is and like Milwaukee currently is, it's much, much easier to put people to work and get them off the welfare rolls. It's much easier to be successful when the economies are growing. But when there's a recession, and if history is like history always has been. There will be a recession. That's when we're going to have to worry about what happens. And for all of the things that Mayor Norquist says about cities going it alone, and Milwaukee may, my guess is a lot of mayors out there aren't like John Norquist. And they're probably not as good as mayors as John Norquist. And they're going to ask for help from their states, and the states are going to start feeling the pressure. And these nonprofits represent good church-going people, corporations, businesses, and they're going to be responding to this pressure for emergency assistance. And I think that's where we're going to start seeing the emergency assistance being demanded from the states and the federal government. And that's where I think we'll see the effort to resolve the deficit get pushed off a year, or perhaps 2 years, just like we saw during the 1980s with Gramm-Rudman. Remember Gramm-Rudman, when it got our deficit down to zero? I think the same kind of dynamic could just as easily exist in the 90s and the next decade as existed in the 1980s. When these pressures start to come down the pike, it'll be easier to push off the resolution of the deficit 1 year than it will be to say to the cities and say to the states and say to the nonprofits, gee, I'm sorry, we simply can't respond because we have to meet our 2002 deadline. So I think that I think the nonprofits, it's because of the knocking on the door problem after eligibility has expired. But obviously there's going to be a lot of interesting innovation and competition and some good things going on at the local level.
I would just disagree with a piece of that, the sort of whining, knocking on the door, wanting money strategy. As cities, we've done that for more than 50 years, and it doesn't work. It doesn't get the money. I mean, the louder we whined, the faster revenue sharing disappeared. And we did go into recession for a while between when revenue sharing ended and when where we are today. If you look at the groups and organizations and interests that get money from the federal government, they don't whine. I mean, it's like the federal government spends a lot of money on highways. They invest in highways. They subsidize transit. You know, so transit is begging for money. Highways are invested in. The military, it's always a question of national security, and it's very clear that the benefit isn't just to them, it's to the whole country. And you look at even causes that are very hard to identify merit for, like the sugar subsidy, which is just gross. Your Archer Daniels, Midland, and all the rest of them begging for. Oh, I'm sorry, I saw them on the list here. Excuse me. But they.
I didn't want to say anything, Mayor.
Yeah, sorry. Well, they do the Jim Lehrer show too. So what are you going to do?
Cut his mic off.
But
No sugar for your coffee.
But the point is that they don't beg money for that. They somehow concoct some argument. They don't say they're down and out. They say they're rich. You know, they ride in our helicopter and take care of us. But so I really think it'd be a mistake if we started getting the nonprofits, the cities, and everybody else to think that, okay, when we've got a recession coming up sometime in the next decade, let's get ready to start whining and crying, because it won't work. The money will not come. I didn't say we didn't get federal money in Milwaukee, and I didn't say we didn't apply for it. I just said we don't beg. And if the federal government ever gives us any money, it's an investment.
I want to thank all the panelists. And we have just one brief announcement from Ambassador Derigian.
Tomorrow we will reconvene the conference at 9 o'clock in Studi Hall, opposite this hall, for the final panel on tax policy. Thank you.